May 1st, 1943, 10:47 in the morning, over the English Channel, 38 miles southwest of Brest, France. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith stood in the waist section of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress No. 42-29649, breathing smoke through a wool sweater wrapped around his face. The radio compartment behind him was an inferno. The tail section ahead blazed with aviation fuel fire. Between these two walls of flame, Smith was alone. The radio operator had jumped. Both waist gunners had jumped. They were dead now, somewhere in the cold water below. Smith did not know if the pilots up front were alive or dead. The interphone was destroyed. He could not ask. He could only see that the bomber was still flying, still holding formation with the other fortresses limping home from the submarine pens at Nazaire. This was Smith's first combat mission, 32 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds. A tax collector from Cairo, Michigan, who had joined the army to avoid jail for unpaid child support. His crewmates called him Snuffy, after the shiftless comic strip character, because nobody could stand him. He had been in England for 6 weeks before anyone would fly with him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Now the ball turret beneath the aircraft had lost electrical power after German flak tore through the fuselage. Smith had cranked himself out manually, climbing back into the bomber through the armoured hatch to find his aircraft dying. In 90 minutes, this disagreeable little man would become the first enlisted airman in the United States Army Air Forces to receive the Medal of Honor. But at 10:47 on the morning of May 1st, he was simply trying to understand what was happening to him. The fire in the radio room had melted the metal. Ammunition was cooking off in the heat, 50 caliber rounds exploding in their boxes. Smith had already emptied 2 fire extinguishers. The flames were not diminishing. Through the smoke, he could see the tail gunner crawling toward him from the burning tail section, Sergeant Roy Gibson. Smith did not know Gibson well. Nobody on this crew knew each other well. They had been thrown together for this mission because the regular ball turret gunner was unavailable. Gibson was leaving a trail of blood on the deck. Smith grabbed him, rolled him onto his left side to keep blood from drowning his good lung, administered a morphine syringe from the first aid kit, and went back to fighting the fire. Then he heard the sound, the deep throbbing of a Focke-Wulf 190 radial engine. The German fighter was lining up for another pass. The waist guns stood unmanned. Smith dropped the extinguisher, grabbed the right waist gun, and fired a burst at the WWII as it came in from 3 o'clock. The fighter veered off. Smith crossed to the left waist gun and fired again as the aircraft passed underneath. The German did not return. Smith picked up the extinguisher again. The fire was spreading. The heat had become so intense that the aluminum skin of the fuselage was beginning to fail. Large holes were melting open in the sides of the aircraft. Smith began throwing burning debris through these holes. Ammunition boxes, radio equipment, pieces of melted metal. Anything that was feeding the fire went overboard into the channel below. The question that would later occupy military historians was simple. How did this man, universally disliked, considered a troublemaker and a fool, perform with such clarity in circumstances that had caused 3 experienced combat airmen to abandon the aircraft? To understand what happened aboard 42-29649, you must first understand what the United States Army Air Forces believed about strategic bombing in May 1943, and what they believed about the men who flew those missions. The doctrine was elegant in its theory. Heavy bombers, flying in defensive formations at high altitude, could penetrate enemy airspace without fighter escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to validate this doctrine. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, service ceiling of 35,000 feet, range of 2,000 miles with a 4,000-pound bomb load. Most importantly, 13 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns distributed throughout the aircraft. 2 guns in the nose, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail, additional guns in the radio compartment and chin turret on later models. The theory held that bombers flying in tight formation, called a combat box, could create overlapping fields of fire that would destroy any fighter attempting to attack. The Germans would lose pilots faster than they could train replacements. American industrial capacity would replace bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. By May of 1943, the 8th Air Force had been testing this theory over occupied Europe for nearly a year. The results were proving more complicated than the doctrine predicted. The mission to Saint-Nazaire on May 1st was the 8th Air Force's 126th heavy bomber mission of the war. 78 B-17 seconds were dispatched. 20 failed to make the rendezvous and had to accelerate to catch up, a strain that caused 5 to abort with mechanical problems. 6 more turned back with various failures. Bad weather forced 38 additional bombers to abort. Only 29 B-17 seconds actually bombed the target. 7 bombers were lost. 73 crewmen were listed as missing in action. 18 were wounded in action. 2 were killed in action. This represented a loss rate of over 9% for the mission. The 8th Air Force calculated that a bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to finish their tour. A 9% loss rate compounded over 25 missions meant that statistically no crew would survive. The men who flew these missions understood the mathematics better than the staff officers who planned them. They also understood something the doctrine did not account for, that the moment of maximum vulnerability for a bomber was not during combat, but immediately after, when damaged aircraft struggled home alone, separated from the formation, trailing smoke or fuel, with wounded crew and failing systems. German fighters learned to follow the formations back toward England, picking off stragglers. A bomber that survived the target run could still die over the channel. The crew of 2-29649 had watched this happen that morning. They had seen other fortresses go down over Brest, had watched parachutes blossom in the flak-filled sky, had seen bombers lose engines and fall behind, attracting foe 190s like sharks to blood. Now they were the wounded bomber. Now they were the straggler. The doctrine said they would be protected by their own guns, by the discipline of their crew, by American engineering and American courage. The doctrine did not account for what would happen when the aircraft caught fire, when the interphone failed, when half the crew bailed out in panic, leaving the others to save the bomber or die with it. The Sperry ball turret was perhaps the most psychologically demanding position on a B-17. A clear plexiglass sphere, 4 feet in diameter, suspended beneath the fuselage of the aircraft. The gunner entered through a hatch in the floor of the bomber, lowered himself into the turret, and pulled the hatch closed above his head. He sat in a fetal position with his knees drawn up to his chest, 2 50-caliber machine guns between his legs, feet in stirrups that controlled the turret's elevation, hands on control grips that rotated the sphere 360 degrees. A gun sight frame helped him track targets. The turret was electrically powered. Without electrical power, it could be cranked manually, but this took considerable time and effort. The ball turret gunner had the best visibility of anyone on the bomber. He could see the entire lower hemisphere. Enemy fighters, attacking from below, had to pass directly through his field of fire, but this visibility came at a cost. The turret was cramped. Most ball turret gunners were small men, selected specifically because they could fold themselves into that limited space. They wore heated suits because the turret was uninsulated, exposed to exterior temperatures that reached 40 degrees below zero at altitude. They wore oxygen masks because the turret had no independent oxygen supply, only a hose connection to the aircraft's system. Most critically, there was no room in the turret for a parachute. If the bomber was hit and going down, the ball turret gunner had to crank himself back to the zero position, align the hatch, open it, climb out into the fuselage, locate his parachute, clip it on, and then jump. This took time that a dying bomber often did not provide. There are documented cases of ball turret gunners trapped in their turrets when bombers made wheels-up crash landings. The turret, suspended below the fuselage, hit the ground first. The results were invariably fatal. Beyond the physical constraints, there was a psychological dimension. The ball turret gunner hung beneath the aircraft in a transparent bubble. When flak burst around the formation, he watched the black smoke and red flashes bloom directly in front of his face. When enemy fighters attacked from below, he saw them coming, saw the muzzle flashes from their cannons, watched the tracers arc toward him, and had time to understand that he was about to be hit and could do nothing except fire back and hope. Other crew positions had at least the illusion of protection: the aluminum skin of the fuselage, the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. The ball turret gunner had only plexiglass between himself and the war. Maynard Smith had been selected for the ball turret because of his size, 5 feet 4 inches, 130 pounds. He fit. This was the beginning and end of the selection criteria. The Army Air Forces trained ball turret gunners in 6 weeks. Gunnery fundamentals, aircraft recognition, turret operation, first aid. That was the extent of the preparation. Then they were sent to England and assigned to combat crews. Smith had arrived at RAF Thurley in March of 1943, the 306th Bomb Group, 423rd Bombardment Squadron. He was 32 years old in a unit where most men were 22. He had worked as a tax collector. Before that, he had lived with his mother, unemployed, spending an inheritance from his deceased father. He had married twice, divorced twice, fathered a child he did not support. When a judge gave him a choice between jail and the army, he chose the army. He had no particular patriotism. He had no particular courage. He had nothing in his background that suggested he would perform well under stress. The mission briefing had begun at 0400 hours on May 1st, 1943. The target was the German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the Bay of Biscay coast of occupied France. The Kriegsmarine had constructed massive concrete bunkers there, reinforced structures with walls 11 feet thick, capable of sheltering German U-boats while they rearmed and repaired between Atlantic patrols. Allied intelligence calculated that destroying these pens would force German submarines to operate from more distant bases, reducing their effective patrol time in the Atlantic by as much as 40%. The problem was that the pens were nearly indestructible. Previous raids had cratered the decaims surrounding dock facilities, but left the bunkers themselves largely undamaged. The mission planners kept sending bombers back, hoping that enough high explosive dropped from enough bombers would eventually compromise the structural integrity of the reinforced concrete. Captain Lewis Johnson was the aircraft commander of 4-2-2-9649 that morning, 26 years old, a veteran of 7 previous missions. His co-pilot was First Lieutenant Robert McCallum. The navigator was First Lieutenant Stanley Kisseberth. The bombardier and nose gunner was Staff Sergeant J.C. Maylaun. The flight engineer and top turret gunner was Technical Sergeant William Farrenhold. The radio operator was Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, a veteran of 22 missions, one of the most experienced men in the squadron. The waist gunners were Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard and Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukacek. The tail gunner was Sergeant Roy Gibson, and in the ball turret, making his first flight into combat, was Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. The bomber carried 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs. Fuel load was 2,400 gallons. The aircraft weighed approximately 54,000 pounds at takeoff. They departed RAF Thurley at 07:15 hours, forming up with other bombers from the 306th Bomb Group in the grey English dawn. The plan called for 78 B-17 seconds from multiple groups to converge on Saint-Nazaire in a coordinated strike. Weather over the channel was poor, thick cloud cover at 8,000 feet, visibility less than 2 miles. Many bombers became separated from their formations. Some turned back rather than proceed alone. Others pressed on, trying to catch up with their groups. 4-2-2-9649 made it to the target. The bomb run began at 10,000 feet. Saint-Nazaire was defended by over 200 anti-aircraft guns, German 88mm flak batteries, lighter 37mm and Doubluk, 20mm automatic cannons. The bomber crews called Saint-Nazaire Flak City. The reputation was earned. As the bombers approached, the anti-aircraft fire intensified. Black smoke bursts filled the sky. The concussions rocked the aircraft. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin. Each bomber held course, The bombardier hunched over his Norden bomb sight, making minute corrections, waiting for the precise moment to release. Bombs away at 10:32. The formation turned northwest, back toward the Channel, back toward England. They had been over the target for less than 10 minutes. Now came the most dangerous part of the mission. The German fighter bases at Brest and Lorient were less than 50 miles away. Luftwaffe pilots waited for the bombers to leave the flak zones, where German anti-aircraft fire prevented fighters from attacking. Once the bombers were clear of their own flak, the fighters pounced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 306th Bomb Group flew over Brest at reduced altitude, still trying to reform after the bomb run. 15 to 20 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters rose to meet them. The WWII was one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters. BMW radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, maximum speed of 410 miles per hour, armed with two 13mm machine guns in the nose and four 20mm cannons in the wings. Flown by experienced pilots, many of them veterans of the Russian front, the FW-190 could tear a B-17 apart in a single pass. The German pilots knew where to aim. They targeted engines. They targeted the cockpit. They targeted the thin aluminum skin between the bomb bay and the tail, where fuel lines and control cables ran exposed. 42-29649 was hit by anti-aircraft fire first. A shell burst near the left wing, shrapnel puncturing the number 2 fuel tank. Aviation gasoline began streaming from the ruptured tank. Then the fighters attacked. 20mm cannon shells walked across the bomber's fuselage. The radio compartment erupted in flames. The oxygen system was severed. Control cables were cut. The electrical system was damaged. In the ball turret, Smith felt the turret lose power. He began cranking manually, trying to rotate back to the exit position. It took several minutes. By the time he opened the hatch and pulled himself back into the fuselage, the bomber was on fire and the radio operator was already gone. Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, the radio operator, had 22 missions of experience. He had survived the raid on Wilhelmshaven in January. He had survived the attack on the Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen in March. He had seen bombers shot down. He had seen friends die. When he came up through the radio room on May 1st and saw the wall of fire, he made his decision in seconds. He grabbed his chest parachute, clipped it on, and jumped out the waist door into the Channel. Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard, one of the waist gunners, followed him immediately. Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukacek hesitated. Smith saw him struggling with a parachute strap that had caught on something. Smith helped him free it. Bukacek asked if Smith was jumping too. Smith said no. Bukacek looked at him for a moment, then went out the door. All 3 men were killed. Their bodies were never recovered from the cold water of the English Channel. Smith was alone in the burning centre section of the aircraft. He could not communicate with the crew in the nose. The interphone was destroyed. He did not know if they were alive or dead. He could see that the bomber was still flying, still in something resembling controlled flight, so he assumed the pilots had survived. Behind him, toward the tail, Sergeant Gibson was crawling forward from his position, wounded and bleeding. Smith grabbed a walk-around oxygen bottle, wrapped a wool sweater around his nose and mouth to filter the smoke, and attacked the radio room fire with an extinguisher. The fire had started when cannon shells ruptured the fuel tank and ignited leaking gasoline. The radio compartment was a confined space packed with electrical equipment, all of it now burning. The magnesium components of the radio set burned with intense white heat. The rubber insulation on electrical wires produced thick black smoke. The temperature was high enough to melt aluminum. Smith emptied the first fire extinguisher. The flames diminished but did not go out. He grabbed a second extinguisher. Before he could use it, another FW-190 came in from the right. Smith dropped the extinguisher and ran to the right waist gun. The weapon was a Browning M2, 50 caliber, belt-fed, air-cooled. Rate of fire approximately 800 rounds per minute. Smith had trained on this weapon at gunnery school, but had never fired it in combat. He grabbed the handles, swung the gun toward the approaching fighter, and squeezed the trigger. The gun hammered against his shoulder. Tracers arced across the sky. The fall of 190 was closing at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. Smith held the trigger down, walking his fire into the fighter's flight path. The German pilot broke off his attack, rolling away beneath the bomber. Smith crossed to the left waist gun and fired again as the fighter passed underneath. He did not know if he hit anything. He knew only that the fighter did not return for another pass. The fire was spreading. Smith went back to work with the second extinguisher. The heat had become so intense that the .50 caliber ammunition stored throughout the waist section began to cook off. Individual rounds exploded in their boxes. Belts of ammunition detonated in chains of small explosions. Smith grabbed the burning ammunition boxes and threw them out through the waist door. He threw out ammunition belts. He threw out pieces of melted radio equipment. He threw out everything that was burning and not bolted to the aircraft structure. The fire was consuming the bomber from the inside. If it reached the fuel tanks still containing gasoline, the entire aircraft would explode. Sergeant Gibson had made it forward from the tail. Smith examined him. A cannon shell had passed through his back, probably puncturing his left lung. Gibson was conscious, but barely. Smith laid him on his left side to keep blood from filling his right lung. He administered a morphine syringe from the first aid kit. There was nothing else he could do. Gibson would live or die based on whether they could get the bomber back to England before he bled out internally. Another fighter attacked. Smith manned the guns again. Fired. The fighter broke off. Smith went back to the fire. The extinguishers were exhausted. He wrapped cloth around his hands and began beating at the flames directly. The heat burned through the cloth. Smith's hands blistered. He ignored it. The fire was dying now, starved of fuel, everything flammable already consumed. But the damage was catastrophic. Large sections of the fuselage skin had melted away or been blown out by exploding ammunition. Smith could see daylight through holes 2 feet across. The aircraft's structural integrity was compromised. He began throwing out everything that added weight: tools, equipment, spare parts, anything to lighten the load and reduce stress on the damaged airframe. The attacks continued intermittently for another hour. Each time, Smith manned the waist guns and drove the fighters off. Between attacks, he worked on the fire, monitored Gibson's condition, and threw excess weight overboard. He did not think about heroism. He did not think about medals. He thought about very simple things. Keep the fire from spreading, keep the fighters away, keep Gibson alive, get the bomber home. Everything else was irrelevant. At 11:57, 1 hour and 10 minutes, after the initial attack, 42-29649 crossed the English coast near Land's End, the southwestern tip of Cornwall. Captain Johnson had been nursing the damaged bomber home on 3 engines. The No. 2 engine had been shut down after taking flak damage. The control surfaces were barely responding. Cables had been severed. Johnson and McCallum were flying the aircraft using trim tabs and throttles, making crude adjustments, unable to execute anything resembling normal flight control. They had no communication with the rear of the aircraft. For over an hour, they had not known whether anyone in the back was alive. They had seen 3 parachutes deploy shortly after the attack. They assumed everyone else was dead. Johnson began looking for a place to land. The bomber could not make it back to Thurley. It was a miracle it had made it across the channel. The aircraft needed to be on the ground immediately, before the damaged fuselage failed completely. Johnson spotted an airfield near Prydanak, a small grass strip used by RAF Coastal Command. He radioed the tower, declared an emergency, requested permission to land. The tower cleared him immediately. The landing gear was the next problem. The hydraulic system was damaged. Johnson was not certain the gear would extend. He tried the emergency hand pump. The main gear came down. The tail wheel remained retracted. Johnson had no choice. He committed to landing. If the tail wheel would not extend, they would land on the main gear and let the tail drop when speed bled off. It would be a rough landing. It might break the aircraft's back, But it was their only option. 4-2-2-9649 touched down at 12:14 on May 1st, 1943. The main gear held. The tail dropped. Metal shrieked as the tail skid dragged across the grass. The bomber slowed. Stopped. Johnson shut down the 3 remaining engines. Silence. Then the emergency crews were running toward them. Fire trucks, ambulances, ground personnel scrambling to assess the damage. Johnson and McCallum climbed out through the nose hatch. The other crew members in the forward section emerged. They walked back along the fuselage to see what remained of their aircraft. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The center section looked like it had been through a blast furnace. The radio compartment was gone, simply gone. The equipment had melted. The deck had burned through. You could see the ground through the holes in the bottom of the fuselage. The waist section was pocked with shrapnel holes and bullet strikes, long tears in the aluminum where cannon shells had ripped through. The tail section was scorched black from fire. Smith was sitting on the ground next to the aircraft, his hands wrapped in cloth, his face black with smoke. Gibson lay on a stretcher, being loaded into an ambulance. The medics were working on him, checking his vitals, preparing for transport. He would survive. Smith had kept him alive. Johnson walked up to Smith and asked what happened. Smith gave a brief account. The fire, the fighters, throwing the ammunition overboard, keeping Gibson from drowning in his own blood. Johnson looked at the bomber, then back at Smith. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the aircraft itself did not already communicate. Ground crews began examining the damage for the official report. They counted over 3,500 bullet holes and shrapnel strikes. The aircraft was a total loss. Even if it could be repaired, the cost would exceed the price of a new bomber. 4-2-2-9649 had flown its last mission. 3 days later, the bomber was officially salvaged. Stripped for parts, the fuselage cut up for scrap. The most damaged sections were kept for investigation, to determine exactly what had failed and how. One photograph from the salvage documentation survives. It shows the radio operator's compartment from the outside. The entire side of the fuselage has been blown out or melted away. The structural ribs are exposed. You can see completely through the aircraft from one side to the other. That Smith fought a fire in this space, while under fighter attack, while ammunition was exploding around him, while the aircraft was structurally failing, seemed beyond belief. But the evidence was there in the wreckage. The fire had been contained. The fighter attacks had been repulsed. The aircraft had made it home. These were facts that could not be disputed. On July 15, 1943, Secretary of War Henry Stimson travelled to RAF Thurley to present Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith with the Medal of Honor. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty." Smith became the first enlisted airman in the United States Army Air Forces to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The ceremony was planned as a major public relations event. Bomber crews assembled on the flight line. A military band stood ready. Photographers positioned their cameras. Fighter aircraft prepared for a flyover. Secretary Stimson waited at the podium with the medal in its presentation case. Staff Sergeant Smith was not present. A search party was dispatched to locate him. They found him in the mess hall, on kitchen police duty, scraping food from breakfast trays. He had been assigned to KP as punishment for some minor disciplinary infraction. This was reported by Stars and Stripes correspondent Andy Rooney, who covered the ceremony. The story shocked readers back in the United States. How could a Medal of Honor recipient be on KP duty on the very day he was to receive the medal? The answer was simple. Smith's heroism on May 1st had not changed who he was as a soldier. He remained difficult, argumentative, resistant to discipline, unable to get along with his fellow airmen. The 306th Bomb Group tolerated him because they had to. They did not like him any better after his heroism than before. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after May 1st. Then a medical board examined him and diagnosed operational exhaustion, what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. He was removed from flight status, grounded, assigned to administrative work. His performance in these assignments was poor. He showed up late. He argued with officers. He ignored regulations. On December 17, 1944, Smith was demoted from staff sergeant to private for unsatisfactory duty performance. He accepted the reduction in rank and continued in administrative roles, no longer flying, no longer in combat, simply serving out his time until the war ended. He met Mary Rayner while stationed in England. She was a British civilian, a volunteer with the United Services Organization. They married in 1944. After the war, Smith returned to the United States with his new wife. They settled in Florida and had 4 children. Smith worked various jobs. He started a magazine called Police Officer's Journal. He worked as a security guard. He attempted several business ventures that largely failed. He had legal troubles, minor offences, nothing serious. But the pattern continued. The man who had shown extraordinary courage under fire could not seem to function in ordinary peacetime life. In interviews years later, Smith spoke about the May 1st mission with a mixture of pride and embellishment. He claimed he had entered the cockpit to treat wounded pilots and had actually flown the bomber back to England himself, even though he had no pilot training. This was false. Captain Johnson and Lieutenant McCallum had flown the aircraft the entire way, but Smith's embellishments became part of his personal mythology. He signed letters Sergeant Maynard Smith, CMH, using the British convention of placing medal initials after one's name. He attended veterans' reunions. He spoke at VFW posts. He became, in his later years, more comfortable with his war service than he had been while actually serving. Andy Rooney, who had written the Stars and Stripes article about Smith's KP duty on the day of his medal ceremony, reflected on Smith's story in a 1979 interview. Rooney said he had been proud of exposing the military's bureaucratic absurdity, the image of a hero scraping food trays. But Rooney also acknowledged something else. Smith was not likable. He was not the kind of hero that makes for good propaganda. He was troublesome, difficult, and strange. Yet his actions on May 1st were undeniable. Courage, Rooney concluded, has nothing to do with whether a person is pleasant or agreeable. It has only to do with what they choose when choice becomes impossible. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith died of heart failure on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His grave marker reads, Maynard H. Smith, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II, Medal of Honor. The date of his heroism is not mentioned. The mission is not described. Just the rank, the service, and the medal. For Smith, that was enough. The story of Snuffy Smith forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about heroism and character. The military, like any large institution, prefers its heroes to be exemplary in all ways. Good soldiers, good men. People whose courage reflects well on the service and whose personal conduct validates the decision to honor them. Smith was none of these things. He was a poor soldier. He was unpleasant as a person. His post-war life was marked by failure and petty legal troubles. Yet for 90 minutes on May 1st, 1943, he performed at a level that few men could match. This suggests that heroism is situational rather than dispositional. It is not a quality that some people possess and others lack. It is a response to circumstances that most people will never face. Smith had no history of courage before May 1st. He had no particularly courageous actions after, but when the moment came, when the choice was between fighting the fire or abandoning the aircraft, he fought the fire. When the choice was between manning the guns or hiding from the fighters, he manned the guns. When the choice was between helping Gibson or saving himself, he helped Gibson. These were not decisions made by a brave man. They were decisions made by a man who, in that specific moment, chose not to run. The military eventually recognized that men like Smith were more common than they had assumed. Operational exhaustion, combat fatigue, shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder. The terminology changed, but the reality remained constant. Men broke under the stress of combat. Some broke before their first mission, some broke after their 25th. Some never broke but carried invisible damage for the rest of their lives. The Army Air Forces in 1943 was only beginning to understand this. They removed Smith from flight status after 5 missions, a recognition that he could not continue. This was actually progressive for the time. Many men were forced to keep flying long after they should have been grounded. The other men who flew with Smith that day received less attention. Captain Lewis Johnson completed his tour of duty and returned to the United States. Lieutenant Robert McCallum did the same. Technical Sergeant William Farrenhold, the flight engineer who had tried to reach the rear of the burning aircraft but could not get past the fire, flew additional missions. Sergeant Roy Gibson, the tail gunner Smith saved, recovered from his wounds and eventually returned to duty. None of them received the Medal of Honor. Their actions on May 1st were professional and competent, but not deemed extraordinary. Only Smith's performance rose to that level. This reveals another uncomfortable truth. The men who maintained discipline, who followed their training, who performed their duties exactly as instructed, were not considered heroes. The man who should not have been there, who had no business being competent, who exceeded every expectation by simply doing what needed to be done, he was the hero. The military values consistency and discipline, but it reserves its highest honors for anomalies, for the men who break the pattern, for the moments when ordinary rules cease to apply and someone does something inexplicable. Smith's Medal of Honor was the first awarded to an enlisted airman in the European theatre. 4 more enlisted airmen would receive the medal during World War II. All 5 were gunners. None were pilots or officers. This was not accidental. The officer corps flew the aircraft and made the decisions, but the enlisted men manned the guns and fought the fires and died in the waist sections and tail positions. Their heroism was more immediate, more visceral, more obviously life-threatening. An officer could be heroic through command decisions. An enlisted man could only be heroic through direct action. Return now to 10:47 on the morning of May 1st, 1943, to Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, standing in the smoke-filled waist section of a burning bomber, 38 miles from the English coast, alone, and trying to understand what was happening to him. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Not his privileged childhood, not his failed marriages, not his civilian career as a tax collector, not his 6 weeks of gunnery training, not his reputation as the most disagreeable man in the 306th Bomb Group. He had no reason to believe he could fight a fire in a burning aircraft. He had no reason to believe he could drive off German fighters. He had no reason to believe he could save Roy Gibson's life. But he did these things anyway. The question is not why Smith acted with courage on May 1st. The question is why this surprises us. We expect heroism from certain types of people: trained soldiers, natural leaders, men with courage in their personal history. Smith was none of these. He was exactly the type of person we expect to fail under pressure: small in stature, disagreeable in personality, undistinguished in background, and yet when pressure came, he did not fail. He succeeded beyond all reasonable expectation. This suggests that our models of heroism are incomplete. We look for heroes among the obviously heroic. We search for courage among the demonstrably courageous. We miss the fact that heroism often emerges from unexpected sources. That courage is not a trait people carry with them but a choice they make in moments of extremis. Smith made that choice. The 3 veteran crew members who bailed out made a different choice. Both choices were understandable. Neither choice was obviously wrong, but only one choice resulted in the aircraft making it home. The bomber crews of the 8th Air Force flew in conditions that tested men beyond their limits. The loss rates in 1943 approached 25% per mission on the worst raids. A crew had to survive 25 missions to complete their tour. The mathematics was brutal. Most crews did not make it. They were shot down. They crashed. They ditched in the Channel or the North Sea. They burned. They froze. They suffocated at high altitude. They bled out from flak wounds. They died in dozens of ways that the training manuals never mentioned. And yet they kept flying, mission after mission, raid after raid, until they completed their tour or died trying. Smith flew only 5 missions total. His contribution to the air war was negligible in statistical terms. 1 aircraft saved, 1 wounded gunner kept alive, 3 crew members lost. The bomber destroyed anyway, salvaged for parts 3 days after landing. The mission itself achieved little. The submarine pens at St. Nazaire remained operational despite the bombing. The German U-boats continued operating from the facility. The May 1st raid was neither a success nor a failure. It was simply one more mission in a long campaign that would continue for 2 more years. But for the men aboard 42-29649, Smith's actions were everything. They meant the difference between 7 men coming home and 4 men coming home. They meant Captain Johnson could land the aircraft instead of ordering everyone to bail out. They meant Sergeant Gibson survived instead of bleeding to death over the channel. These were small victories in a vast war, but for the men involved, they were total. The irony of Smith's story is that heroism did not change him. He remained difficult after May 1st. He remained unpleasant. He remained incapable of functioning well within military discipline. The Medal of Honor did not fix whatever was broken in his personality. It simply recognized that for 90 minutes, those broken pieces arranged themselves in a pattern that looked like courage. And that was enough. That had to be enough. Because war does not care about character. It cares only about what you do when the choice is narrow to binary options. Fight or flee. Act or freeze. Live or die. Maynard Harrison Smith, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds, disagreeable, difficult, decorated, dead at 72, and buried at Arlington. The pump maker who became a gunner, the gunner who became a hero, the hero who became a private again, the private who became a memory. His story is not inspirational in the conventional sense. It does not teach us that anyone can be heroic. It teaches us something more valuable, that heroism is not about who you are, but about what you choose when everything is burning and you are alone, and the only way out is through the fire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.